That morning looked just like any other in the Ohio countryside: gray sky, quiet wind, and the smell of coffee floating through the kitchen. My son David was 24, then tall, strong, and full of plans. He poured himself a cup, kissed his mother on the cheek, and joked that she'd better save him a slice of pie for dinner. She laughed, told him not to be late, and he promised he wouldn't. I watched from the porch as he climbed into his old blue pickup. The tires crunched over gravel, echoing down the road between bare trees. For a moment I thought about calling out, maybe to remind him about the rain coming, or to check his gas tank. But I didn't. He waved once through the window, and I waved back, certain I'd see him again that evening. It's strange how ordinary days can hide the moments that change everything. You never know when a simple goodbye becomes the one that stays with you forever. When his truck disappeared over the hill, I remember feeling something, a heaviness I couldn't name. Maybe it was just the weather. Maybe it was the world trying to whisper what I refused to hear. If I'd known that was the last time I'd ever see my son's face, I might have held his gaze a little longer. I might have told him how proud I was, how grateful I felt for every sunrise he brought into our lives. But I didn't. I just stood there, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the dust settle where his truck had been. That's how the story began. Not with a scream or a crash, but with silence, and a father waiting for a sound that never came back down that road. The hours that followed felt heavier than usual. There was nothing dramatic about it, just that strange, quiet kind of tension that sneaks in without reason. The air outside seemed thicker, the sky pressing down like a lid. Around noon, a light rain started to fall, soft at first, then steady enough to blur the fields beyond our porch. I tried to keep busy in the shed fixing an old mower that had been waiting weeks for my attention, but my hands wouldn't stay steady. Every few minutes I caught myself checking the clock or glancing down the driveway, waiting to hear that familiar sound of tires on gravel. By late afternoon, my coffee had gone cold again. Inside the house, my wife couldn't sit still. She kept moving between the stove and the window, folding the same dish towel over and over, as if that small motion could quiet the unease in her chest. Every so often she'd ask, "What time is it now?" and I'd answer, even though we both already knew. The hours were crawling, and with each one that passed, the silence grew heavier. I told myself not to worry. Maybe traffic had slowed him down. Maybe the rain had forced him to stop somewhere along the road. He was always cautious, never reckless. I reminded her of that, trying to sound calm even as my own words rang hollow. But there's something about a parent's instinct that doesn't let you rest. It's like a thread pulling at the back of your mind, warning you even before the facts arrive. As the light began to fade and the fields turned gray, that feeling grew louder. The house, once warm and alive, started to feel unfamiliar too, still too quiet. By 5 o'clock, I was standing by the window watching the rain slide down the glass, whispering to myself that any minute now I'd see his blue truck come around the bend. But the road stayed empty. The rain stopped, yet the silence stayed. When the sun finally dipped behind the trees, I knew deep down that something wasn't right. The kind of wrong that doesn't need proof, only time to show its teeth. And as I turned off the porch light, I told myself it was just another delay. Still, a voice inside me whispered, otherwise something had already changed, even if I couldn't see it yet. By the time the sun began to slide behind the trees, that uneasy feeling had turned into something sharper. 6 o'clock came and went. At 7, my wife started pacing the kitchen, her hands twisting a dish towel so tight it looked ready to tear. At 8, she picked up the phone and called the mill, hoping someone might still be there. A man answered, his voice tired and casual. He said David had clocked out like always, joked a bit with the guys, and mentioned heading straight home. That was it. No arguments, no strange behavior, nothing that hinted at what was coming. Just an ordinary end to an ordinary day, or so everyone thought. When she hung up, I tried to keep her calm. Maybe the truck had broken down. Maybe he'd stopped to help someone on the road. David was that kind of person, the one who'd pull over to change a stranger's tire or help push a stalled car out of traffic. But as each minute stretched longer, the explanations started to feel like excuses. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of metal and mud. I stood at the window looking down the empty road, half expecting to see his headlights appear over the hill. Nothing. Only darkness settling in the kind that makes every sound feel too loud. By 9, she was crying quietly, her face pale and distant. I made coffee neither of us drank. The smell of it filled the room, but it didn't bring comfort. It only made the silence heavier. There's a kind of fear that doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slow like water rising behind a dam until one small crack lets it rush through. That's how it felt that night, like something invisible had shifted in our lives, something that couldn't be undone. If I'd known that phone call from the mill would be the last ordinary sentence I'd ever hear about my son, maybe I would have asked more questions. But how could I? Nothing seemed broken yet. Nothing except the clock whose ticking suddenly felt cruel. I kept telling myself, just wait a little longer. He'll walk through that door any minute now. But deep down, a small voice whispered, what I refused to believe, the boy who promised to be home for dinner wasn't coming back. By 2 in the morning, I couldn't sit still anymore. The house felt too quiet, too heavy, like the air itself was waiting for bad news. I grabbed my coat, told my wife to leave the porch light on, and drove out into the rain. The windshield wipers clicked back and forth in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Every few miles, I slowed down to scan the roadside, hoping to see his truck pulled over, maybe with the hood open or the headlights flashing for help. But the road stretched on, dark and endless. I stopped at the gas station near the turnpike where David sometimes filled up. The clerk looked half asleep under the flickering light, but when I showed him my son's photo, he shook his head, said he hadn't seen anyone like that since the morning before. I bought a cup of stale coffee just to have an excuse to stand there a little longer. It went cold before I even took a sip. From there, I checked the diners along Highway 32, places where truckers stop late at night, where the jukebox hums low and the coffee never runs out. I pushed open each door, the bell above it ringing like a cruel reminder that I was still the only one looking. Every face turned for a second curious, then went back to their plates. No one recognized the picture in my hand. The rain fell harder as I turned onto the back roads. Headlights cut through the mist, catching bits of fog that looked like ghosts drifting over the fields. I thought I saw movement, once a figure by the ditch, but it was just a branch swaying in the wind. Each mile felt longer than the last. The world outside my window had shrunk to 2 narrow beams of light and the sound of tires on wet pavement. I whispered his name a few times, like maybe he'd hear me somehow, as if the night could carry a father's voice farther than reason. By dawn, I'd driven the same stretch of road 3 times. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the porch light was still on, casting a weak circle of yellow across the wet gravel. My wife sat by the window, hands wrapped around a cup gone cold. She didn't have to ask what I'd found. I didn't have to answer. That silence between us said everything. Somewhere out there, our son had vanished, and the world had no intention of giving him back. By the next afternoon, exhaustion had replaced fear. I'd barely slept, yet my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time the phone rang, my heart jumped. But it was never him. It was always silence calling back. That's when I decided to phone the police. The officer who answered sounded calm, too calm. I explained that my son hadn't come home, that it had been over 24 hours, that this wasn't like him. I gave every detail I could think of: his height, the color of his truck, where he worked, what time he left. The officer listened quietly, scribbling notes like it was routine. When I finished, he said something that made my stomach turn. Sometimes adults just need a few days, he told me. Maybe he wanted some time to clear his head. Let's wait it out before assuming the worst. Wait it out. As if a father could wait while his son was out there somewhere alone. I tried to argue, to explain that David wasn't the kind of man who disappeared. He wasn't running from debt or trouble. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't have secrets. He worked hard. Came home for dinner, called his mother every Sunday. He was steady, reliable, the kind of person who kept his word. But the officer's tone didn't change. "Give it another day or two," he repeated. I thanked him because I didn't know what else to do. then hung up the phone and just stood there. The kitchen felt smaller, the air colder. I looked around the room at the ordinary things, the coffee pot still half full, his mother's coat on the chair, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Everything was exactly as it should be, except he wasn't here. That absence was louder than any sound. I walked to the window and stared out at the empty road again. The sun had slipped behind the clouds and the light in our house seemed to fade with it. I could still hear the officer's voice echoing in my head. Adults sometimes take off, but not my son, not David. A chill crept through me, then the kind that has nothing to do with weather. It felt like the world had dimmed, as if someone had quietly turned off the lights on everything we thought we understood. That night, as the rain began again, I sat by the phone waiting for a call that wouldn't come. And for the first time since he left, I realized that hope could hurt just as much as fear. The official search began the next morning. 2 officers came by to gather information, their notebooks open, their expressions politely detached. They asked questions that didn't seem to lead anywhere. When did he leave? What was he wearing? Did he have any reason to run away? I answered each one carefully, as if the right detail could somehow bring him back. They promised to look into it, words that felt too small for the size of our fear. They started at the steel mill, checking the parking lot where David usually parked his old blue truck. It wasn't there. They asked his coworkers, the men who had known him for years, who'd shared coffee breaks and cold mornings with him. Every one of them said the same thing. He clocked out like always, waved goodbye, and drove off toward home. No one saw him after that. Then came the river search. I remember standing on the bridge while officers in raincoats scanned the water below. The current moved slow, gray, and endless. They dragged it 3 times and found nothing. No truck, no trace, not even a scrap of metal to suggest he'd been there. Each time they came up empty-handed, I felt the ground shift a little more beneath me. They checked hospitals next, then morgues, then rest stops along the highway. I drove behind them sometimes, not because I was asked to, but because I couldn't bear sitting still. I needed to see for myself that he wasn't in any of those places, even though every visit left me emptier than before. When the local news picked up the story, our faces appeared on television, his mother holding one of his shirts, me standing beside her like a man caught between disbelief and prayer. The reporter called it a mystery disappearance, their tone too practiced, their eyes already moving toward the next headline. 3 days later, the coverage stopped. New stories came along, louder, flashier, tragic in their own ways, and ours disappeared like he had. People in town tried to help at first. They printed flyers, shared his photo, asked if we needed food or company. But after a week, the visits slowed. After a month, they stopped. The world, I learned, doesn't wait for those who are missing. It moves on. Only the ones left behind keep circling the same empty space, waiting for a sound that never returns. The police called less often, too. At first, every few days, then once a week, then nothing. Each time they spoke, their voices sounded more distant, more tired, like they were reading from a script written for parents who would never get answers. The silence that followed was the hardest part. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the kind that settles into your walls, your heartbeat, your prayers. Everyone else forgot. But in our house, forgetting wasn't an option. Every empty chair, every photograph, every echo of his laughter was a reminder that the world had moved on. But we were still stuck in that moment when the road swallowed him whole. That's when I realized something cruel about grief. It doesn't end when the search does. It just changes shape, growing quieter, heavier, until it becomes part of who you are. After the search faded and the voices stopped calling, the house fell into a silence that never really left. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that settles in like fog, thick and unmoving. Every sound became sharper in that quiet, the creak of a floorboard, the whistle of the wind through the trees, the low hum of the refrigerator filling the space where laughter used to live. David's boots stayed by the front door, still dusted from that last walk across the gravel. His jacket hung on the hook beside mine. His plate sat untouched on the kitchen table for weeks before my wife finally moved it, not to put it away, but to set it closer to the window where she could see it every morning. She said the light made it feel less lonely. Every morning she would pull back the curtains and stare down the same long road he'd driven away on, waiting for the familiar sound of that old truck engine. Sometimes she'd whisper to herself, "Maybe today." She said it softly, not as a question but as a ritual, something between prayer and habit. I think part of her believed that if she just kept saying it, he'd hear her wherever he was. I tried to keep the house alive, fixing the porch steps, mowing the lawn, tightening loose hinges, but even the tools felt heavier in my hands. Everything creaked like it was grieving too. The air smelled like stillness. There were days when I'd walk through the hallway and swear I could hear him laughing from his room, the echo of a life that used to be. The porch light never went out. We left it on that first night thinking he'd see it from the road when he came home late, and somehow turning it off felt like giving up. That yellow glow became our silent signal to the world we're still waiting. Time inside that house didn't move the same way it did outside. Seasons changed, leaves fell, snow came and melted, but nothing shifted within those walls. The calendar pages turned, yet every day felt like the same one replaying itself, one endless loop of waiting, hoping and pretending that hope still mattered. People say homes hold energy, that they remember the emotions soaked into their walls. Ours remembered everything. Every tear, every whispered prayer, every unfinished sentence that ended with his name. It was like the whole house had stopped breathing the moment David vanished. Sometimes late at night I'd wake up and hear my wife walking through the hallway, her steps light and uncertain. She would pause at the front door, hand resting on the knob as if she was about to open it. Then she'd whisper something I could barely hear. Maybe his name, maybe a promise. I never asked. Some things you don't need to understand to feel. That's how we lived, not really living, just existing between what was and what never came back. The world outside kept turning, but inside our home, time had stopped, the moment that blue truck disappeared down the road. At first people tried to help. Neighbors brought casseroles and warm words, stopping by to check in. Friends called to remind us not to lose faith. The mailbox filled with cards that said things like "thinking of you" and "stay strong." But as weeks became months, the visits slowed. The calls stopped. People have lives to return to, dinners to cook, kids to raise. Grief that doesn't end makes people uncomfortable. So little by little they drifted away. The house grew quieter. Sundays came and went without company. Holidays passed with empty chairs at the table. The sound of the phone not ringing became louder than anything else. It's strange how silence can have a weight. It presses on your chest until even breathing feels like effort. Hope at first felt like the only thing keeping us alive. Every sunrise was another chance for news. Every knock on the door, a heartbeat of possibility. But over time, hope changed. It became something heavier, something that hurt to carry. It turned from comfort into habit and then into a curse. My wife still looked out the window each morning, but the way she said "maybe today" began to sound less like belief and more like muscle memory. It was as if her body remembered the motion even when her heart didn't. I started saying it too, not because I believed it, but because not saying it felt worse. That's how waiting traps you. It turns faith into routine and routine into survival. Our world shrank to four walls and the silence between them. There were no arguments, no laughter, no plans, just two people sharing the same grief in different languages. She waited with hope. I waited with guilt. Together we filled the space with all the words we didn't say out loud. Sometimes I'd catch her sitting in the dark long after midnight, the porch light still burning. When I asked if she was coming to bed, she'd whisper, "Not yet." And I understood. That small pool of yellow light was her last thread of connection, her way of telling the world we hadn't given up completely. There's a point in grief when time stops moving forward and just circles the same moment again and again. That's where we live between what used to be and what would never be again. The days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. And in that endless waiting we learned a cruel truth. Sometimes love doesn't fade. It just becomes the reason you can't move on. Waiting, once an act of faith, had turned into our punishment, and yet even knowing that neither of us could stop. Because the moment we stopped waiting, it would mean accepting that he was truly gone. Time didn't heal anything. It only wore us down in slow, invisible ways. The days blurred together until the years started to feel like one long winter that never melted. My wife's health began to fade first. At the hospital, they said it was stress exhaustion, maybe depression. I told them it was heartbreak. They didn't write that down, but I could see it in her eyes every time she looked out the window. She stopped going outside. The sunlight made her wince, as if it was too bright for a world where David was still missing. She kept the curtains half closed, saying the light made the house look too hopeful, and hope had become something that hurt to look at. When spring came, she couldn't stand to see flowers bloom. She'd say the world had no right to move forward when her son hadn't come home. I tried to help her the only way I knew how, by pretending things were normal. I cooked her favorite meals, played the same old country records David used to hum along to. I kept the radio low so she wouldn't cry when a love song came on. I'd tell her stories from town, like how the mill hired new workers, or how the neighbor's dog had puppies just to fill the air with something other than silence. But the truth was, I was crumbling too. There's a kind of fatigue that doesn't come from work or age, it comes from carrying a question too long. Every day without an answer adds a new layer of weight. I could see that weight pressing down on her shoulders, turning her movements slow and careful, like she was afraid she might break if she moved too fast. At night I'd find her sitting in David's room, running her hands over the quilt his grandmother made, whispering words I couldn't make out. I didn't interrupt. Some grief is private. It's not meant to be shared, it's meant to be survived. Doctors offered medication, therapists offered comfort, but none of it could fix what was broken. What she needed wasn't rest or medicine. She needed to see her boy walk through that door again. And since that would never happen, her spirit began to close in on itself, shrinking to fit the shape of her pain. She became afraid of new beginnings, afraid of the morning light, of laughter, of seasons that dared to keep changing. I understood it. Because when someone you love disappears, time becomes your enemy. It keeps proving day after day that they're not coming back. Sometimes I'd sit beside her, holding her hand as she stared out the window. She'd whisper, "Do you think he's cold, or maybe he just forgot the way home?" And I never had an answer that didn't sound cruel. So I'd just squeeze her hand tighter, praying that somehow, through that small gesture, she'd feel what words could no longer say, that we were still here, still waiting, even as time tried to wear us away. After my wife passed, the house finally became too quiet to bear. The air inside felt heavy, like grief had soaked into the walls. There was no sound of her footsteps, no soft hum of her voice calling my name from the kitchen. Just silence, endless and echoing. One morning, without a plan or a word to anyone, I locked the front door, put the key in my pocket, and walked away. I drove west, chasing something I couldn't name, maybe peace, maybe punishment. The road stretched ahead like a lifeline, 1 mile blending into the next. I slept in motels that smelled like dust and gasoline, where the hum of vending machines was the only reminder that the world still moved. Each new town felt both foreign and familiar, because they all carried the same thing I did, stories of people who had gone missing, and the ones who couldn't stop searching. I picked up odd jobs wherever I could, fixing fences, painting barns, repairing roofs. It wasn't about the money. It was about keeping my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander back to the sound of that empty house. But no matter where I went, hope followed. It sat in the passenger seat like an old friend I didn't ask for, but couldn't shake. People along the way would mention sightings. A man working at a gas station in Colorado said he'd met someone who looked like my son. A waitress in Nevada swore a truck driver passed through who fit his description. Each rumor lit a small fire inside me. I wrote them all down in a small notebook I carried everywhere. Dates, names, towns, scraps of hope written in shaky handwriting. Sometimes the leads were weeks apart, sometimes months, but I chased every single one. It didn't matter how far. I'd drive through the night headlights, cutting through endless highways, my heart pounding with the same question: what if this is it? And every time it wasn't. I'd find a stranger with kind eyes, or a similar smile, but never him. You'd think disappointment would get easier with repetition, but it doesn't. It just changes shape. It stops breaking you suddenly and starts wearing you down slowly. Like waves against a rock, the edges of who you are start to fade. Still, I couldn't stop. Hope had turned into a kind of addiction, the cruelest one there is. You keep feeding it even when it hurts you, because the pain feels better than emptiness. At night in those cheap motel rooms, I'd open the notebook and read through the names and towns again. It looked less like a map and more like a confession. Every line was proof that I didn't know how to let go. I'd stare at the ceiling and imagine David as a grown man, wondering if he ever thought of home or if the world had taught him to forget. I told myself I wasn't searching for him anymore, that I was just traveling. But deep down I knew better. I wasn't trying to find a place. I was trying to find the version of myself that existed before the silence, before the house stopped breathing, before hope turned into a habit I couldn't quit. In Colorado, I finally stopped running. I found work on a small ranch outside of town, fixing fences, feeding animals, doing whatever needed to be done. The pay was enough to keep me afloat, and the owner was kind enough not to ask questions. I think he saw something in me, maybe the look of a man who needed to stay busy just to survive. The days followed a simple rhythm. Up before sunrise, coffee in a chipped mug, the sound of roosters breaking the quiet. By evening, I'd sit on the porch watching the sky fade from gold to gray, listening to the hum of crickets in the tall grass. There was peace in that kind of repetition, the kind that dulls your thoughts just enough to make living bearable. I learned how to exist without waiting. I stopped glancing at the phone every time it rang, stopped expecting a familiar voice on the other end. I learned to breathe without hope feeling like a knife in my chest. That might sound like healing, but it wasn't. It was survival in its simplest form, learning how to carry silence without letting it crush you. 5 years passed that way. The seasons came and went, each one leaving its mark. Winter froze the fences, spring brought the mud, summer baked the ground hard as stone. I worked through them all. My hands grew rough, my back stiffened, but my mind quieted. It's strange how physical pain can feel easier to bear than emotional loss. At least with sore muscles you know why it hurts. Still, grief has a way of sneaking back in through the smallest cracks. I'd be in town buying supplies and catch a glimpse of a man around David's age, same broad shoulders, same way of walking, and my chest would tighten before I could stop it. For a split second the years would collapse and I'd almost call out his name. But I never did. Those moments passed as quickly as they came, leaving behind a kind of ache that didn't need words. Sometimes at night I'd dream of him not as the grown man he would be, but as the boy who used to help me fix the old pickup or throw rocks into the river behind our house. In those dreams, everything was simple again. I'd wake up before dawn with tears on my face, ashamed and grateful at the same time. I used to think peace meant forgetting, but it doesn't. It means learning to live beside the pain like an old neighbor you stop fighting with. You don't invite it in, but you nod to it, acknowledging that it's there, that it has a place in your life now. And that's what I did in Colorado. I lived quietly, worked hard, and tried to convince myself that letting go wasn't the same as giving up. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Some part of me was still scanning every crowd, still listening for his voice in places where it didn't belong. You can move across states, change your life, change your name even, but you can't outrun the sound of someone you're still waiting for. 35 years had passed. My hair had gone gray, my hands shook more often than not, and my body carried the quiet stiffness that comes from years of working and wandering. I had settled into a small trailer on the outskirts of Tucson, tucked between stretches of desert and open sky. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A bed, a table, and a television that hummed like company. Most mornings were the same. I'd wake before the sun, make my coffee, and sit by the small window watching the desert shift from blue to gold. The air was dry, the silence deep, the kind that lets you hear your own heartbeat. Routine had become my way of surviving. I didn't hope for miracles anymore, but I wasn't bitter either. I'd simply learned to exist quietly one day at a time. That morning felt no different. The television was on, playing softly in the background, just noise to keep the loneliness from echoing too loudly. I wasn't really watching some local news channel, was droning about politics, the weather a story about a lost dog. I sipped my coffee, half listening, half floating somewhere between memory and the present. Then something shifted. A headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Federal agent arrested in identity case. The words barely registered at first, just another headline in a world full of them. But something about it made me look up. Maybe it was the photograph that appeared next to the text, a man in handcuffs being led out of a courthouse. I leaned forward, heart suddenly pounding. My breath caught halfway in my throat. The image was grainy, the man older, his hair gray and his face lined with years. But even through the blur I saw it, the eyes, the jawline, the shape of his mouth when he tried not to show emotion. It was him, David. For a few seconds, I forgot how to breathe. The coffee cup slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor, but I barely heard it. My entire world tunneled into that screen that moment. 35 years of silence, of searching, of praying for an answer, and now there it was, staring back at me from a television screen in a trailer thousands of miles away. I didn't understand. I didn't want to. My mind tried to protect itself, to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the news had it wrong. But the caption was clear. Born in Ohio. Missing since 1989. It was like the air had been knocked out of my chest. After decades of wondering if he was dead alive, or somewhere in between, the truth had found me not with comfort, but with confusion. Outside, the desert was calm, the sky stretching wide and cruelly beautiful. Inside, everything in me began to unravel. I had spent a lifetime waiting for a miracle. I just never imagined it would look like this. The camera froze on the image of a man being led out of a courthouse, his wrists bound in handcuffs, flashbulbs exploding all around him. The picture was grainy, the kind of low-resolution footage that usually blurs every detail. But not this time. My breath caught in my throat because I knew that face. The gray hair, the tired lines around his eyes, the jaw set tight as if holding back emotion. It was David. My son. For a few seconds the world around me disappeared. The noise of the TV faded. The hum of the refrigerator vanished. Even the wind outside seemed to stop moving. All I could see were those familiar eyes staring out from the screen, older, now harder, but unmistakably his. I had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways over the years, finding him alive, maybe broken, but still my boy. But never like this. Never in handcuffs. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. My coffee cup slipped from my hand, shattering against the linoleum floor. The sound barely reached me. I leaned forward, staring at the screen as if getting closer would somehow change what I was seeing. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. The news anchor's voice droned on, detached and professional. Words like false identity investigation, multiple passports floated in the air like smoke. Then the caption appeared at the bottom of the screen, clear and cruel. Born in Ohio. Missing since 1989. There it was, confirmation of what my heart already knew. The boy who had vanished 35 years ago, the one I had buried 100 times in my imagination, was alive. But not as my son. He had become someone else entirely, a man who had built a life under another name, another story, another truth. I didn't feel joy, not even relief. What I felt was something colder, heavier, a confusion so deep it almost felt like grief all over again. How could the same face I had prayed to see for decades now feel like that of a stranger. I sat frozen, staring at the image as it replayed again and again, each time cutting deeper. He looked strong, healthy even, but different. The softness in his expression, the warmth that once lived in his smile was gone. In its place was a look I didn't recognize, a man who had long since let go of his past. When the report ended, I didn't turn the television off right away. I couldn't. It felt like if I did, he'd vanish again. So I sat there in the flickering blue light, surrounded by silence, watching the screen fade to commercials about car insurance and breakfast cereal, while my world quietly fell apart for the second time. I had spent half my life begging for answers, but the truth, when it finally came, didn't feel like salvation. It felt like punishment. The news kept playing, and with each word the weight in my chest grew heavier. They weren't saying he had been kidnapped or lost his memory. No, the truth was far colder. David hadn't been taken from us, he had chosen to leave. He had built an entirely new life under a different name in another state. And to make it real, he told people his family was dead. That single sentence cut deeper than any knife could. His family passed away years ago. It echoed in my head long after the broadcast ended. For decades I had prayed that my son was still alive somewhere, believing that one day he'd remember the road home. But now I realized he had erased us himself. We weren't waiting for him, he had buried us. I sat there for hours, the TV screen flickering with noise I couldn't hear. 35 years of searching, of sleepless nights, of whispered prayers, all collapsing under the weight of a truth I never wanted to know. It wasn't death that took my son. It was choice. I couldn't stop myself. I called the police station in Nevada, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone. I told them my name, his name, the one he used to have. There was a long silence on the other end before an officer finally said, calm but cautious, "Sir, he doesn't wish to speak with anyone from his past." My heart stopped. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, trying to believe I'd heard wrong. I told them I was his father, that his mother had died waiting for him, that I only wanted 5 minutes. No anger, no questions, just to see him one last time. The officer's voice softened, but his words didn't. He said his family passed away years ago. That broke something in me I didn't know could still break. For years I had imagined him hurt, lost, unable to reach us. I thought maybe he'd been protecting us from something. Maybe he'd been trapped by circumstances beyond his control. But now, faced with the truth, I realized I had been protecting myself from it all along. The truth was simple, brutal, and final. He didn't want to be found. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, staring at nothing. The room felt smaller than it ever had before. The air was thick, almost hard to breathe. I had spent my entire life building my days around hope. Hope that he'd come back, that he still needed me, that family meant something that couldn't be erased. But in that moment, I understood that hope can be a kind of prison too. It keeps you standing in the doorway long after the world has moved on. It keeps you setting an extra plate at the table for someone who has already forgotten your name. I wasn't grieving a death anymore. Death has an ending. What I felt was something worse, being erased from your own story, left alive in a world where your child pretends you never existed. Outside, the desert sun kept shining cruel and bright, as if mocking the darkness that had settled inside me. I had spent 35 years begging for the truth, and now that I had it, I wished I never knew. After the call, silence became my only company again. The world had given me an answer, but not the one I had prayed for. Still, I couldn't stop trying. I began writing him letters, dozens of them, each one carefully folded and mailed to the address of the federal facility mentioned in the reports. In those letters, I didn't ask for explanations. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him that I forgave him even if I didn't understand. I wrote about his mother, how she had kept his photo by the bed until the day she passed, how she never stopped believing he would walk through the door again. I told him I still called him my boy every time I saw his face in my dreams. None of the letters ever came back. None were answered either. I don't know if he read them or tore them apart. Maybe both. But I kept writing anyway, because sometimes the act of reaching out is the only way to keep from falling apart. After a while, the story disappeared from the headlines. The reporters moved on to newer tragedies. The phone stopped ringing. Even the officers who once called for updates went silent. It was like the world had collectively decided to forget. But forgetting was something I had never learned how to do. And then one morning I realized he was gone again. Not taken, not lost, just gone. This time by choice, and this time for good. I sat on the porch of my small trailer, the desert stretching endlessly in front of me. The sky burned orange in the west, the kind of color that makes you believe the world still holds warmth somewhere. That's where I sit most evenings now, coffee in hand, watching the sun disappear behind the horizon. I don't pray for his return anymore. But if one day somehow he finds his way back, if I hear that knock on the door after all these years, I'll still open it. Because love doesn't vanish when someone leaves. It just changes shape. It becomes quieter, deeper, something you carry in your chest even when the person it belongs to no longer remembers you. I don't blame him. The world can be cruel and sometimes running feels like the only way to survive. But no matter how far he goes, he'll never be truly gone. Because in some small corner of this world there's still an old man who remembers every laugh, every word, every moment of the boy who once promised he'd be home by dinner. And if that boy ever comes home again, I'll be waiting, door open, light on. Always.